Hello, OSH 310 class. Hope you're having a fantastic week. Let's go ahead and dive into some of this material as there's a little bit to go over and some pretty important details just to be able to remember. All right, let's start it. So this week, we're going to be going over indoor air quality. If you remember, last week we did ambient air quality, which is all of the air outside. Now we're going to be doing all of the air that's inside, whether it's your home, whether it's your workplace, whether really anything. As long as it's inside, that's what we're talking and dealing with. So why is this important? Well, there are some estimates that are over here in this picture that I decided that would be a good introduction as well. That estimates that there are 70 times more hazardous pollutants inside your air rather than outside your air. A lot of the time, that's just because of ventilation and dilution that can be able to happen naturally outside, where inside it can't always. We have to be a lot more proactive in that. The same thing is that the average person actually spends roughly about 90% of their time indoors, whether again, that's at home or that's at work or something like that. So if there's things in your indoor air, you're constantly being exposed to those things. Most volatile organic compounds, or VOCs, that are potentially hazardous enter into your home through your furniture, through paints, carpet, any sort of cleaning supplies, variety of different sources. And again, you're kind of trapped in this confined space with these VOCs. We're going to be going over VOCs a little bit later as well if you're not very familiar with them. It's also estimated that 50 million Americans suffer from asthma and or allergies that could be worsened by poor air quality. I saw another study that said that there's been roughly about 150% increase in the rates of asthma within the American population, just within the spans of about, I think it was 60 years. So this really indoor habitat that we're really kind of subjecting ourselves to, it really does have an impact on us just over the long period of time. Same thing, 99.98% of airborne particles, mold and bacteria, can be removed by air cleaners and humidifiers. A relatively simple procedure could be able to help out. But let's go ahead and start diving into indoor air quality, what it is, what some of the pollutants are, and some of the content. So first, there are 4 things that we hope to be able to achieve by the end of this lesson. We're going to be going over identifying the different types of indoor air pollutants, or IAQ, indoor air quality, and as well as how to test for them. Also describing the mold cycle and the mold triangle, and then evaluating different types of mold testing that you can perform, what are the pros and cons of each. And then also we're going to be discussing a circumstance or a condition known as sick building syndrome. And so keep going. So what is indoor air quality? So again, just like I was saying, last week it was air outside, now it's air inside. Air quality within and around buildings. A lot of IAQ, or indoor air quality, has to do with the comfortability of occupants within the building. Honestly, IAQ is possibly the bane of an industrial hygienist's existence, just because IAQ, it's very difficult to be able to pinpoint exactly what's happening to someone. If you take into account, for example, or if you, in comparison, compare someone who's welding on stainless steel, we know what's in the welding sticks and what's in the flux. We know what's in the metal. We can be able to test for what they could be feeling symptoms for and kind of pinpoint it. But with indoor air quality, it's such a variety of things that could be going on, could be interacting, could be psychosocial or psychosomatic, and it's a lot harder. Effects of indoor air quality, they could be acute, they could be chronic, they could happen all of a sudden, or they could take years to develop. It's a very difficult thing to be able to test, but it is a very real thing for those who are experiencing poor indoor air quality. There's a variety of different tools that we could use. These are just a matter of fact thing. You don't have to memorize the specific meters itself. We use things such as 5-gas meters, which localizes 5 different gases such as sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, oxygen, as well as the lower explosive limit. Probably wouldn't need those in an office setting, but it measures just some gases that are common culprits of indoor air quality issues. Same thing in IAQ meter, which that looks at as far as what like even the moisture, the humidity is within the air, which can also add to this. Same thing, a moisture meter, specific air sampling, if you might have an idea of what could potentially be impacting them, but it's still really hard to figure out. The most effective way, however, to control IAQ is that source control, is trying to be able to pinpoint down exactly what it is and being able to control it. And then as well, the primary cause of IAQ problems typically is due to inadequate ventilation. So these two may sound similar, they may sound a little bit confusing, but hopefully this picture here on the right can help kind of demonstrate it. I'm sorry it cut off the very top, but it's the hierarchy of controls, which we've gone over previously in this class, and it's very, very important. Not only having to do with safety and environmental and industrial hygiene, but it has to do with a very basic principle, which is how do we control things within our life? What is the most effective to the least effective? So we start off with elimination, just eliminate the problem itself. It's pretty effective in being able to remediate that problem. If you can't eliminate it, substitute it. Can we make something less hazardous by having something else in its stead? For example, WD-40. So if you didn't know, WD-40 actually has two different recipes. One is California-based and one is non-California-based. So everywhere else in the entire world. The everywhere else in the entire world recipe contains xylene. Xylene is actually a fairly hazardous chemical. There's a lot of things going on to it. It's an autotoxin as well, but it can be able to impact you if you don't take the proper controls with it. California has said, no, we will not accept that. And so they've substituted out that xylene for a less hazardous chemical. It's still hazardous, but it's a less hazardous one. That's an example of substitution. Then we get into engineering controls. Those are your things like ventilation, things or items that you add to a tool to be able to help remove a hazard. Then administrative controls, that's changing how people work, whether that's make it so people are rotating in different jobs to be able to make it less time exposure to a hazard. And then there's PPE or personal protective equipment. Those are things like masks or gloves or a Tyvek suit or a respirator, things of that nature. Whenever we're talking about an effective control for IAQ and source control, we're talking about this very highest parts right here, which is elimination, trying to just flat out get rid of it if we can, substituting it if we can, if we know about it and there's some form of it has to stay, if we can substitute it for something less hazardous, and then engineering controls as far as controlling it at its source with something like ventilation. And the primary cause of IAQ problems, again, inadequate ventilation. That's typically there's not enough air circulating within your building, so you're being more exposed to a particular substance or substances that are causing you issues. Hopefully that makes sense. Kind of diving more into it, and we can be able to go over it if you have any other questions. This is another great example. It's just a picture that illustrates the top two pictures on the top right, top left. Illustrate poor ventilation, no open windows, no fans, no portable air cleaners. There's a lot of dots, which just represents particulates that happen to be in the air. For example, this one states at 2:30 p.m. And then as time goes on at 3:30 p.m. There's a little less, but it's probably just naturally settling on the ground, maybe kind of floating away. Again, you're thinking of these particulates, they're extremely small, extremely light. They can really be influenced by the air a lot. But if there's no moving air from windows or fans or cleaners, then they're really still just kind of hanging around. It makes sense that those particles aren't going to be going anywhere. Whereas if you, on that bottom left and bottom right, if you compare that to somewhere with good ventilation, open windows, a ceiling fan running, a window exhaust fan blowing air outside, or portable air cleaner, all of these things moves that air. And just that movement of the air, we can be able to see just from this example, the 231, there's quite a few different particulate dots. And then an hour later, considerably less, if almost none. What it again just demonstrates is that good ventilation is very, very important to be able to control a lot of these things. So IAQ pollutants, these are the things that we're going to be going over just very briefly. These are important things just to be able to know, and I'll try to highlight some of the really important facts just as we're going through this. That will be important for you to know, not only for assignments and things, but just kind of condensing down that reading material. So that includes IAQ pollutants, includes asbestos, biological pollutants such as bacteria and viruses, volatile organic chemicals, or VOCs, that also could be chemicals or compounds, radon, carbon monoxide, carbon dioxide, and mold. So now we're going to go into each one of these items and just talk a little bit about it, how it affects indoor air quality, and things to be able to that might be specific to each one. So in asbestos. All right, so we've already kind of talked about asbestos. So just to kind of recap, it's a naturally occurring fiber. It's just naturally found in the earth, in the rock, in the ground. One of the reasons why it's an issue for indoor air quality is that there was a period of time before it was banned here in the United States, and it was banned in other countries as well. It was used everywhere, everywhere. People thought that this was the miracle building item because it's very high strength, it's very light, and it's heat resistant, which is amazing for building materials. However, it kills you, and that's not fun, from what I hear. So prior to it being banned, it was used in so much stuff: insulation, floor tiles, roofing shingles, paper products, cement, vehicle brake pads, gaskets, hot water pipes, heat-resistant fabrics. The thing is you can actually still find a lot of this still containing asbestos in some form. And as well, the biggest thing is that if you're looking at building materials, typically a good rule of thumb is if you're demolishing anything, the only thing that's considered generally safe is anything made of wood or glass. Anything else could potentially be contaminated with asbestos in some form or another. So any demolitions or remodels, especially if it was made during that time, whenever it could be legal, it could have been implemented, it's always good to be getting it tested and sampled before you remove it. Health effects, it could cause asbestosis, lung cancer, mesothelioma. So one of the interesting things about asbestos as well is that symptoms can be made worse by smoking. A lot of these IAQ pollutants, you're going to find that if you're smoking as well, almost the health experiences that you're going to be experiencing are going to be much, much worse. Case fatality rate is typically quadrupled at least with a majority of these things because it affects your respiratory system tremendously. For asbestos, for example, I believe this was asbestosis specifically. If you smoke and you have asbestosis, your death rate is actually 28 times higher than just the average population, which is insane. It's flabbergasting, but it all affects that respiratory system that we really need to be taking care of best we can. That picture there on the left, that's just an example of a friable asbestos. This is actually not from a building compound. This is actually from a rock mineral itself. And then over there on the right, you could be able to see these are two individuals that they're remediating up some floor tiles. You can't really see it. Those are some scraper items that they're utilizing to be able to pry up these floor tiles, as it most likely has been confirmed that there's some asbestos in them. And if you remember back with previously, some of the PPE, personal protective equipment they have to wear as far as taping up their gloves, that Tyvek suit, respirator, glasses, booties, the whole gambit. But that's really it about asbestos. Just know that it is potentially an indoor air quality issue just because of some of the um, potential remodels, demolitions, and things that could happen within an office space or within a home. Next, we're going to talk about biological pollutants. Biological pollutants, that could be able to include bacteria, viruses, fungi, animal dander, house dust, bird poop, mites, cockroaches, and pollen. Basically anything that potentially could be living. I know viruses technically aren't living, but still it's lumped into that same category itself. Or it comes directly from something that is living. Okay, so health effects. Some of the key things that you can be able to find from being exposed to some of these biological pollutants could be hypersensitivity, pneumonitis, inflammation within the lungs itself, allergic rhinitis, inflammation inside of the nose and the nasal cavities, up just kind of in your head. As well as the development of asthma or the exacerbation of asthma related symptoms. Same thing, flu-like symptoms such as sneezing, watery eyes, coughing, fever. It really kind of runs the gambit of not so serious to very, very serious. And that's why, again, similar to the ambient air pollutants, indoor air pollutants are also hard because they affect individuals differently. Just because I'm exposed to it and just because you might be exposed to it doesn't mean our bodies are going to react the exact same way. We're all our unique little snowflakes in that way, and how our body reacts to these pollutants. Most often found in areas, biological pollutants are often found in areas that possess organic matter and moisture. So again, some really good examples of biological pollutants. Again, we can be able to look up. If you're not familiar with that picture, I don't know where you've been for the past 3 years, but that is the CDC's representation of COVID-19. The COVID-19 virus, that would be considered a biological pollutant. So whenever we're looking at from an IAQ standpoint, if any of you worked during COVID, there were a lot of different types of controls people were trying to do to get people to return back to the office. And so that was definitely IAQ was a huge deal in being able to try to control that so that work could be done, but individuals were also be able to be safe and be able to be okay. Same thing continuing on, that middle picture right there, that's a mama bird feeding the baby birds. I assume it's a mama bird, I don't know. I didn't ask. But one thing you'll notice is it's right on a house. So even though birds, they're really nice to look at, they're kind of there, they are considered a pest actually, just because they could be able to, whether it's not dander necessarily, bird poop, but as well as mites or lice that could be able to jump off from the animals onto people, potentially causing zoonotic diseases, or even just spreading further dust or biological pollutants, bacteria and viruses into a home where otherwise wouldn't have been. So that's just a good helpful hint as well. Even though they're really nice, if a bird is building a nest like in a doorway of your house or onto your house, it's still probably a good idea to get rid of it because it does reduce your indoor air quality. And then as well, that bottom picture, that's just an example of a mite. So that's really it. And some of the things that I guess we previously learned with mites, some of the diseases that they could carry, but even just a general dust or mixing that might not be good for our bodies. All right, indoor air pollutants, volatile organic chemicals, or VOCs. All right, so VOCs is a very general term. It's gas emissions that could come from a solid or a liquid, and there's a very wide variety. There are roughly thousands of different VOCs that you could potentially be exposed to. These things, you could commonly find them in paints, waxes, disinfectants, aerosol sprays, pesticides, fuels, carpets, or glues, whether that be glues for carpets or hobby glue that's used, building materials and furniture. Carpets especially are notorious for this. Health effects that you could experience from it: nose and throat irritation, a general malaise, nausea, fatigue, allergic reaction, dizziness, and headaches. Just very general not feeling well. Um, in more severe cases, it could even lead to overexposure and death as well, depending upon what type of VOC that it is. So it's important to be able to understand that VOCs, it's that gas emission off of something. Um, so again, if we think back to that 5-gas meter, that's one of the things that it tests for is just general VOCs, being able to look at any gas emissions that might be in the air. And it's separate from like carbon monoxide or carbon dioxide, even though they're both IAQ pollutants, those are not considered VOCs. So these pictures right here just illustrate that top left one is just a bunch of different types of glue. Those things, as you lay it down, could potentially off-gas and create VOCs themselves. That top middle picture is just someone with like flu-like symptoms or really not feeling well. And then in that bottom left picture is just some cans of paint, fairly artistic looking if you ask me, but painting as well is another very big source of potential VOC exposure. So more about IAQ pollutants and VOCs. Oftentimes, you can find that VOC concentrations are 2 to 5 times higher indoors than outside. Again, it's that confined type space. And if you look at a different type of VOC generating activity, that could actually be increased to almost 1,000 times higher than what you would find generally outside. And that's again because we're actively applying chemicals or actively working around solids that generate those VOCs. And so it's so important to be able to understand what is a VOC generating activity. So some of the biggest ones or some of the biggest culprits are there on that right picture, painting inside. So sometimes we can't get away from it. We need to paint our house. We need to paint this wall for some reason. That's all right as long as we're taking the appropriate and proper controls. So I actually really like this individual. What they're doing is they have an applicator, a roll-on brush method that they're using instead of like a spraying on it or even just with a paintbrush, where they have an application system that goes from the can down here on the ground directly to the applicator itself. That is a wonderful idea. That actually will reduce the amount of VOCs that are emitted into the air. One, instead of aerosolizing it with a spray, or potentially disturbing it by stirring it around the bucket and slapping it onto the wall. Anything we can be able to do to disturb it the least, that's going to generate less VOCs. Another good example is, buying any new furniture or carpet. Typically, those things, whenever they're in storage at any sort of site or facility, are typically sprayed with material, or just the fabric itself has storage properties in it to be able to make sure that it lasts long enough for it to get to the customer. That's why it's very important, especially if you're recarpeting your house. There's a process known as baking the house. That can be sometimes very helpful. As you increase the heat inside of your house, it'll allow the off-gassing of those VOCs to occur more frequently. And if all of the VOCs are able to be released and then ventilated out, there's less of it to be able to react just as it's sitting there and as you're occupying it. So, for example, baking the house includes you turning up the heat, leaving the house for a couple hours, then coming back, and during that time, of course, open up the windows, everything like that, get some moving, circulating air to then allow all those VOCs to leave while you're gone until you can come back, and hopefully it'll be a little bit safer. But how to control some VOCs, increase the ventilation during these generation activities, modify how you use the products. Again, kind of source control. How are you doing that? Such as this individual that's applying the paint. Allow products, materials to sit before or after installation, such as carpets, and even some sofas. Monitor for it if you're concerned. So for example, like a 5-gas meter, those things can be able to help you to identify if they're rising or lowering VOC rates. Formaldehyde is a very well-known VOC that you can actually directly sample for. It's actually present in a lot of different types of furniture, again, for that storage kind of process until it's supposed to get to the customer, but it's still on there as well to be able to keep in mind. Pesticides could also off gas and release VOCs, so it's also using that integrated pest management system. See, it comes full circle. What we just learned last test. Using those best pest management principles for pesticides could also help lower your VOCs. And also, if I could stress anything from this class, if you learned nothing from this class and just took this away, hopefully you found a better appreciation for reading your labels on your cans and your canisters, your paints, your products, your chemicals, everything. Hopefully you read those things because they can be very informative. So meeting or exceeding those label precautions and the safety controls that the companies are trying to warn you about, those can also be able to help. That's ultimately VOCs that are important just to be able to understand. Next, radon. So radon is a unique one that we're going to be discussing. This is actually radioactive gas, which is pretty awesome if you ask me, but still. So this is naturally occurring. It actually is found just naturally in the ground all throughout the world, especially here in the United States. There's a lot of different places. We're going to talk about it here in a second, but there's a lot of things we can be able to do to reduce our exposure to it because it is a radioactive substance that we could readily be being exposed to. There are at-home test kits. If I would give any suggestion for this, if you move into a new house or a new apartment or anything like that, get a radon test kit. They're not that expensive, and just be able to check it so that you can be able to see what is your radioactive gas exposure that you could be exposing yourself or your family to. There is a target limit whenever it comes to these. So if you're underneath 4 picocuries per liter, then it's generally considered that that's normal, that's about background, that's okay. If it's above, that's whenever you need to start taking maybe some prevention methods. Some of those things could mean like sealing some of the cracks that might be in your basement, since the basement is typically sublevel. Underground, it's a potential higher exposure. Same thing, many basements nowadays, or newer houses that are built just nowadays anyway, they'll have dedicated ventilation ports throughout the house. And a lot of that is just for radon, especially in some of the areas. So if we look at some of these pictures, a nice little radioactive pictogram up there in the top left. Thought that was a nice touch. This graph here on the left is actually, I took that from the readings. I thought it was fantastic. Not the content, but the graph was very well done. But it talks about deaths per year due to radon and being a cause of death. So radon is right behind smoking and the leading cause of lung cancer within the United States, which, again, if you've never heard of radon or never knew of it, that is shocking. Again, it pales in comparison to smoking, but radon in combination with smoking, just like the other one, boost your chances of dying way up. But anyway, we can be able to see that approximately 21,000 deaths occur every single year due to radon. Some comparison items, roughly about 17,500 from drunk driving, 8,000 from falls in the home, almost 4,000 from drownings, and about 3,000 from home fires. So this is a very big deal. Radon exposure could have a tremendous impact on you, but it really just depends where you live and what those exposure levels are. But luckily, there's those at-home test kits that can be able to help out, and so that at least you're aware of what that exposure is. You don't have to know this. I just think it's fascinating. So uranium is actually its first state. So uranium is naturally found just in the earth. But as uranium naturally decays, or radioactive matter decays because it's an unstable nucleus, decays into radium, radium then off gases into radon as it decomposes. And that's where the gas originally comes from. It's not just like natural gas that's just leaking everywhere. It's actually that degradation of the radioactive material uranium that ultimately leads to this gas, which I think is fascinating. But again, biggest items, that underlying thing, try to help you out. Target target standard of less than 4 picocuries per liter. This is a fun little picture. Again, fun is subjective, I guess, but it's just radon levels and zones for each United States county. So on average, this also illustrates that the typical level within all 3,100 counties in the United States is about 1.9 picocuries per liter. And it's just a density map that's illustrating different counties throughout the United States. But you can be able to see over here in like Utah, for example, for the most part, it's about zone 2, which is 2 to 4 picocuries per liter. But there are some areas that are zone 1. And then as we continue up into like Idaho area, I believe right about here is about Rexburg, Idaho, where BYU Idaho is. And so that could be zone 2, possibly even zone 1. A lot of what you're going to be seeing up here in the northern Midwest, that's zone 1. And then down here in the southeast, it could be zone 3. So definitely take some time if you're within the United States. Try to find and try to pinpoint where you're at and be able to know that this may be something you want to look into. But I apologize, I don't have anything for other countries. I know we have a lot of international students in these classes and the curriculum as well. But I'm sure that you can be able to find similar materials through any government-sponsored website within your own areas potentially. But just a little fun activity, just to be able to look into that and how applicable this stuff really is. All right, next, we're talking about carbon monoxide. So I'm sure that you've all heard of this. If you look here in the top right, no, that is not a smoke detector. That is actually a carbon monoxide alarm. Very, very important. Almost just as important as your fire alarm is making sure that you have a carbon monoxide alarm within your household as well, particularly if you have anything that deals with the combustion of carbon fuel. So carbon monoxide, again, recap from the last time we talked about it. It's an odorless, colorless gas, but it kills individuals every single year. It's very important to be taking this seriously and knowing and be knowledgeable about the risk factors of it. It's created due to incomplete combustion of carbon-based fuel. That could be, if there's a flame or there's a fire, there's carbon monoxide in some degree, because combustion never happens perfectly all the time. Each year, 400 Americans die from unintentional carbon monoxide poisoning that is not related to fires. So again, this is something that's not from fires from outside that are coming in or a home fire that then turns into it, but individuals are still dying from carbon monoxide poisoning. It also results in roughly about 100,000 visits to the emergency room and 14,000 hospitalizations just from carbon monoxide alone. Some common carbon monoxide poisoning symptoms down here in the bottom right picture: headache, dizziness, fatigue, blurry or double vision, shortness of breath, confusion, chest pain, nausea, vomiting. A lot of these are flu-like symptoms that can be able to onset fairly quickly. Again, it's understanding that carbon monoxide, what it does is it messes with that oxygen exchange that occurs within our lungs and in our alveoli, and it actually takes the place in our hemoglobin where oxygen would rather be. So whenever our brain is wanting to get oxygen, it's actually getting carbon monoxide, or it's just the hemoglobin isn't releasing the oxygen because it's already accompanied. It already has a dance partner, and that dance partner is carbon monoxide, and it doesn't want to let go. So some prevention methods: ensuring that there's adequate ventilation, utilizing electric-powered utilities instead of gas-powered ones that rely on some combustion of some sort. Install and regularly check CO monitors within your house, and then never using portable generators indoors. in some situations, this is, even though it may sound like a no-brainer, don't use a gas generator inside your house, but there are times where individuals, whether they don't know or just due to emergency, they feel they have to. A great example of this is, I believe it was during the 2021 flash freeze that happened in Texas. So back in, I think, March, yeah, March or February of 2021. I was actually living in Houston at that time. But all of a sudden, there was just this massive cold freeze that came in, and it knocked out power for thousands and thousands of people. And what typically is not a big deal for anyone else in the country, how Texas is set up is their electrical grid is actually separate from the nation's. And so whenever its power gets shut down, which is not very common, whenever it gets shut down, there's no way for the rest of the United States really to be able to help out until Texas kind of figures it out itself. What we saw is a large rise in individuals, again, going to the ER, being hospitalized, or even dying just because they were taking that step of trying to keep warm by having a portable generator inside their house. So it is a serious thing, and it's something sometimes we don't think about, that we are potentially exposing ourselves to, just as a reaction to be okay and to survive. Okay, carbon dioxide, sorry, it was a little tangent, but hopefully it's providing this information so that this information sticks a little bit longer and seems more applicable. That's my main focus on why I do that. Carbon dioxide, also an IAQ pollutant. So the American Society of Heating, Refrigeration, and Air Conditioning Engineers, or ASHRAE, just know ASHRAE, they created a standard for carbon dioxide inside. They say if you have less than 1,000 ppm of carbon dioxide inside your house, you're doing pretty good. Yeah, you're actually doing all right. It's whenever you're above that you need to start implementing some controls, increase in ventilation, doing something so that you can be able to, so that you're not feeling some of these symptoms, as this is a very common pollutant that can be able to happen, and we're constantly being exposed to this every single day. So if there are higher levels, it's an indicator that ventilation is not adequate. You need to fix it. Ramp up that ventilation or reevaluate it, at least, to be able to better understand why is this an issue. So common symptoms: dizziness, vomiting, confusion, weakness. Again, just some of that general malaise, just generally not feeling well. Again, IAQ, a lot of it has to just do with comfortability of the individual whenever they're inside. Some of it's not immediately life-threatening. Down here, this picture just illustrates the difference. Again, carbon monoxide to carbon dioxide. Very similar wording. However, carbon monoxide, it illustrates it by the red and black representative molecules. The red molecule being an oxygen and the black molecule being a carbon. So one carbon, one oxygen, carbon monoxide. And then one carbon, one black molecule, and then two red molecules or two oxygen molecules, that is carbon dioxide, using that, I don't know if it's Latin or Greek, but that di meaning two. So it is very important to be able to, I guess, kind of understand that. Most important is that standard of less than 1,000 ppm for carbon dioxide. Next, the last indoor air quality pollutant we're going to talk about is mold. Mold is the most common fungi in the world. So fungi, I mean, you'll think of mushrooms, anything like that. This is very related, but a little bit different. So moisture and water presence is the leading cause of mold development. With that being said, there's a wide variety of different types of mold. There are thousands and thousands of kinds of mold. But it's understanding that water presence, it's critical for all mold survival. It needs water above everything else. It has to have water there in order for it to thrive and grow and expand. Mold is also one of the few things where it's ubiquitous. So ubiquitous, if you think mold, think ubiquitous. That means it's found everywhere. Just like there's water, basically ubiquitous, mold is also there. It's everywhere that we can be able to imagine. And especially nowadays in the media and also within the past 40 years, mold has been a very hot topic of debate and as well as within the media. Some of the biggest culprits of hyping it up include the media itself, just making it a big deal, lawsuits that are currently present, and then as well, it's actually non-regulated for the most part. OSHA doesn't have a standard for it. EPA doesn't really have a standard for it. NIOSH doesn't have a standard for it. No one really has a standard for mold. Even though there's all this hype from the media and different lawsuits that are going about saying how bad and how terrible it is, there's still no regulation. So going into how bad it is, we can be able to look at health effects, typical inhalation of mold. It could be able to exacerbate allergies that we have, potential asthma. For the most part, mold really only affects individuals that are already sensitive or immunocompromised to a lot of these things. It could also do rhinitis. Again, that's inflammation inside of your nasal cavities. Pneumonitis, that's inflammation inside of your lungs, again, having to do with that sensitivity. However, in some settings, even if you're fairly healthy, due to zoonosis, as far as you're already down because you're suffering from a bacterial or a viral infection, mold can be able to be an extra kicker and making it worse and creating a systemic fungal infection. But then as well, if you're undergoing surgery, molds and fungal infections are a huge deal. Even if you're relatively healthy, whenever we undergo surgery, we're all fairly immunocompromised. And so this is something that hospitals take very seriously, as well as some molds actually contain mycotoxins. So the most common mycotoxin. So mycotoxin just means a toxin that's emitted by the mold. The most common is aflatoxin, which is actually a carcinogenic substance. It's just a toxin that the mold emits. It's carcinogenic to humans, particularly one of the primary culprits are the aspergillosis species. So this picture in the bottom right, that is a picture of aspergillus. It's a very, very common mold, and it's very, very troublesome as well. That top right picture is just another example of mold that could be present. Possibly have seen it in your own house. It's not an indicator that you're really dirty. It just happens. Just because mold is trying to survive and it's trying to grow wherever it can, and it's just important we try to reduce that moisture and try to clean it up as best we can. Okay, so with IAQ pollutants and mold, we need to know the mold triangle. So the readings help out with this one a little bit. The picture is a little wonky, so I created this one just because you can kind of see it clearer. But there are 4 conditions that are necessary for mold to grow. That includes water, proper temperature, a food source, and a viable spore. So again, the mold triangle, not food triangle, that's different. The mold triangle is up here. You can imagine at the very top, or at the 3 points, you have moisture, proper temperature, and food source. And all of these things need to be in function in addition to a viable spore here in the middle. So even though it's a triangle and you think try 3, remember that it's 4 items. And that's because these 3 items have to be there in addition to a viable spore in order for mold to grow. But again, the moisture, I put it at the top, just again emphasizing that's the most important feature. Like sometimes food doesn't necessarily have to be there, or the temperature maybe it isn't the most preferred, but moisture has to be right and it has to be there. But that's the mold triangle. Just remember those 4 things: water, temperature, food, viable spore. In the mold cycle. So the reading is a little wonky with this. So whenever you do, whenever you look at this one, it kind of makes sense. This slide and then the next slide, I try to break it down and make it a little bit easier. But hopefully with these two slides and the reading, it'll make a little bit more sense. But listen to this again. Hopefully we can be able to break it down. The mold cycle is basically the life cycle of mold. How does it go? How does it spread? How does it develop? But I don't go into everything, or I go over everything that you're going to have to know. But this is not the entirety of the life cycle. There are some smaller parts and smaller pieces, but at the very least, know this basic. It starts off with a viable spore. It then goes into a hyphae stage. Then it goes into a next stage known as mycelium, and we'll talk about these in the next slide. I got pictures, hopefully it'll help out. So after the mycelium phase, it develops fruiting bodies. After that, the fruiting body consists of a conidiophore, developing then into a conidia. Sporulation occurs, which is the disbursement of new viable spores. Here's a picture here. It just illustrates it. It's a flow chart. This viable spore, two hyphae. I don't know why this arrow here at the top is there. Into the mycelium. And the fruiting body results in the conidiophore being formed. In the conidia, sporulation occurs, and there are more viable spores. So now let's go into it. Let's have a little bit of pictures and some descriptions. Hopefully that helps out. Let me move this. So again, very first part is viable spore. That means it's a live spore that has a real chance of growing. So it lands on a food source with the right temperature, with some water. Different food sources could be wood, paper, fabric, anything like that. We can be able to see up here in the top right picture, spore of fungus. You can just imagine a dot or a seed. That's a better one. Just imagine like a seed like you're planting. Then it starts to go into its hyphae stage. So hyphae, hyphae, what I'm calling it. Hyphae. You can think of that kind of like how a seed sprouts roots. It develops and it spreads out these branches. And so a spore spreads out a branch known as a hyphae, and multiple of those hyphae are mycelium. So whenever these roots connect together with other spores and other hyphae, it creates this kind of lattice kind of structure of hyphae that is now as a group called mycelium. Hopefully that makes sense. So spore, a seed, the roots, which are hyphae, and as there's a lot of different roots interconnecting, that's your mycelium. Next is your fruiting body. This is where it gets exciting. So here, this middle picture, it illustrates right here at the bottom is a hyphae. So it's one of those roots. A conidiophore, so it also calls out a fruit cell, or foot cell, don't just ignore that. A conidiophore is whenever a stalk appears and grows out of the hyphae. So just imagine a stalk comes out of the hyphae. It's kind of like a tree. And the conidiophore is the name of the stalk. So then at the very top, whenever you're thinking of like leaves or fruit that contain seeds, that is your conidia. So again, let's break it down. Spore, fungus, that's like your seed. It gets planted in the ground. It spreads out roots, otherwise known as hyphae. As there's a lot of different roots all intertwining, that's your mycelium. Whenever a hyphae is matured, it creates a fruiting body, which is the conidiophore and the conidia. The conidiophore is the stalk, kind of like a tree. And the fruit that grows on the tree, that's your conidia. And the conidia itself, those are viable spores. Those are spores that are growing onto that. And so then as sporulation occurs, whether it's through disturbance or the wind, it shakes loose those conidia, And all of those canidia are now viable spores that can be able to land, and the whole process starts again. So this picture right here in the bottom left or bottom right, you can be able to see it's very similar to like how a dandelion works, how a dandelion occurs. Seeds planted, it grows roots, it intermingles with other ones, the stalk is created, it creates little seeds, and then the wind blows those seeds somewhere else for more dandelions to grow. Mold grows very similar to that. Hopefully that makes sense. If not, just please let me know. We can be able to look at it together, but it's important to understand that flow and the order that these things occur. All right, so sampling for mold. There's a variety of different things that you can be able to do, but we're going to focus on 4 different things. So there are swab samples, biocassettes, spore traps, and tape. So tape samples. So whenever you're using a swab, like here on the top right, this, for an example, is actually the little lip of your washer or your dryer. I believe this is the dryer. But what they're doing is a swab is really good and useful whenever you're trying to access hard to reach areas. I thought I had another picture on here that was showing like the crack inside of a wall. You can't really get anything in there, but just a cotton swab is a perfect way to be able to just reach it in and then pull out a sample of what this is. That way a lab can then be able to analyze it. They can look at it underneath the microscope and they can actually deduce exactly what type of mold it is and how much it is, and then be able to help you estimate how big of a problem is this. And a biocassette and a spore trap, they're very, very similar. So if you look up here, the 2 top left pictures, this is a biocassette and an air sampler, and this is also a spore trap biocassette and an air pump, just set up in someone's living room. So both of these things take spore samples out of the air, and then the lab can be able to measure them and be able to see what is the spore count. The main difference is that biocassettes, they're a culture-based sampler, so they're only looking at spores that grow. So for example, they have an agar solution on it, so they're sucking up the spores, and then the lab will allow those spores to grow a little bit so that it can analyze them. Whereas a spore trap, it looks at viable and non-viable spores. So it's counting everything that could be there. And then there's just the tape measure. So if you can easily be able to access the area, you use tape. And you could be able to just put the tape onto a surface, then pull it off. And then you just put it onto a glass sheet, and you can be able to look at it under a microscope and figure out what it is. But just remember, again, if it's a hard to reach area, use a swab. If it's an easy to access area, use tape. If it's in the air but you can't really see it, use a biocassette or a spore trap. So, yeah. All right, so this is one I wanted to be able to share. This is something I'm super excited about because it deals directly with what I do. And so I love talking about myself. But it also just talks about mold sampling in general, and particularly one of the more serious examples of why understanding mold hazards is important. So I had a colleague, he actually was reached out to by a hospital who had a prevalence of patients that were dying due to fungal infections after surgery. It's actually very, very common. And so hospitals, as they're tracking this, they found a pattern dealing with one of the surgical rooms that individuals who went in for surgery typically developed a fungal infection. So they hired him as an industrial hygienist to come out and perform some mold sampling. So with that, it's being able to understand that aspergillus, again, we talked about that previously, has that mycotoxin, aflatoxin. Roughly 2/3 of patients who die or are seriously ill from infection, it's typically due to aspergillus. You'll use a biocassette to be able to sample in the air to figure out where is it or what is the concentration of it that's generally there. And so they hired him. He flew out. He actually flew out with a coworker, and they went in and they were sampling inside of this area. And his colleague, he would then give his colleague the sample cassettes. He would fly to California. There was a lab there that could be able to that 24-hour testing. They could be able to get him the results back really quick. His coworker would then fly back to him with the results. The hospital then would take the results. They would deep clean the entire surgical suite. Colleague would go back. He would sample again. He would give the cassette to his coworker. Coworker would fly to California, get the results, come back. Hospital would see the results. Hospital would deep clean it. This happened like three or four times. 3 times. I already spelled it out here. But it's just illustrating it. Finally, they were able to get it to an acceptable level, and they paid the individual that did this, my colleague, and then he left. But it just illustrates a few different things. One, hospitals take mold and fungal infections very, very seriously, because not only do they affect patients, they also affect money, revenue, and production. Because if there's a specific surgical suite that is inoperable, that is a lot of money that the hospital is not able to make, as well as those are individuals' lives that they potentially could have avoided them getting sick or possibly even dying after this. So I just wanted to be able to also put a little spin for, if you ever thought about industrial hygiene or thought it was really interesting, this was just an example. And it's not too uncommon that this happens. I actually had a very similar event to this happen to me last year, that it just happens. But in total, that colleague, he was paid, him and his companion were paid roughly about, no, this was just specific to him, sorry. Just specific to him, he was paid roughly about $15,000 for a 32-hour job. So the hospital paid him about $450 an hour to come over and just be sampling and analyzing and sampling and analyzing and waiting. It took roughly about 3 hours to sample, and then the coworker would get a direct flight to California and then come back, and it was cleaned, and that cycle was roughly about 3 times, and it resulted in about 32 hours of work. But why? Why did they focus on this? Again, patient health, keeping them alive, but then as well, if they're not able to use that surgical suite, down here is just an estimate. If we took the average that they estimate, it could be anywhere between costing a surgical suite costs anywhere between $7 and $100 a minute. We took an average of that at 57 for a 32-hour period of time that it shut down. That cost that hospital over $100,000. That's a lot, and that's not even counting the amount of money that would cost to for manpower to deep clean it each time, loss of patients because the hospital's not able to perform the work that they need to, and also the cost for surgeons to keep them on staff, but they're not able to do any work. So just to be able to illustrate, one, put a plug in, industrial hygiene, it's pretty lucrative, can be really nice, but how serious that fungal infections and mold actually can be in a variety of different industries. But continuing on, now we're going to talk about, well, that's fun, sick building syndrome. So the important thing to understand, sick building syndrome is not when a contagious disease is spreading throughout the workplace. COVID-19 is not sick building syndrome. Sick building syndrome is actually where office workers are experiencing headaches, respiratory issues, but there's no direct link or cause. It can actually just happen. It's just a general feeling that people have and that they feel sick when they enter the building. This is very real. And it could be for a variety of different sources. However, the big overlying thing is it's typically resolved through improving ventilation. Improve the amount of airflow within a building, people naturally feel better. Whether it was caused by something, whether it's psychosomatic, we don't know. All we know is that it really could be affecting these individuals, and it's something that we really strive to be able to correct and try to be able to help. But improving ventilation, always a good default in being able to help out, because again, the leading cause of IAQ problems, inadequate ventilation. So this is just another example inside of a household, this very last slide as well. But different things that are indoor air quality pollutant producing that could be able to affect the quality of the air inside. So chemicals released from modern building and furnishing materials, animal hair and dander, chemicals from cleaning products, particulate matters, carbon monoxide and other gases from cooking foods, chemical fumes and paint solutions. I believe I saved this photo. I'll try to drop it with this, just be able to look at. I think it brings some good realism. Outdoor air pollutants that might be coming in also could affect the quality. Mold and bacteria, it's showing it like in the bathroom from the shower. Cigarette smoke, combustion gases from fireplaces or wood burning stoves, fumes from attached garages, including carbon monoxide, gases, including radon, seeping through the foundation. There's just such a wide variety of things, and hopefully this has been educational, but hopefully in also helping you prepare for this week's assignments and the upcoming test that will be coming up soon as well. But that's it ultimately. If you ever have any questions, feel free, please reach out. It's my important duty to try to help you understand. So hopefully a lot of my tangents also helped to solidify these concepts a little bit more. But hope you have a great rest of your week. And yeah, I'll talk to you later. Bye.